Hey, welcome to our investment panel. This will be interesting to talk through this as I'm lost my hearing, but I'll have to test my American Sign Language skills. But Imran, Brian, Tony, thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to ask each of you to introduce yourself and your firm. So let's start off with Imran. Please kick us off.
Hey, Jen, I hope you can hear me. And thank you. And Jim, can you hear me, by the way? Yes, okay. This is Brian can hear me. Okay, perfect. Hey, everyone. Good to see all of you. I think I know many of you there as well, but a quick introduction. I'm one of the two partners at a fund called Action Potential Venture Capital. We are a decade-old fund now, backed by GlaxoSmithKline and their efforts within bioelectronic medicines. I'm Boston-based, and my partner is in California. We invest in seed and Series A stage companies, exclusively for financial returns with no strategic rights. But thank you.
Thanks, Imran. Brian Meshkin, how about if you introduce yourself and your firm?
Sure, I'd be happy to. My name is Brian Meshkin. I'm a partner at Profound Ventures. We're a social impact investment group in Southern California. We invest in different technologies and companies that we feel are making a big social impact, one of which is an equity position in a company called Neurara Biotech, which is a next generation sensor and data platform and brain mapping, both sensing and stimulation with brain computer interface. My background between 2017 and 2020 was an entrepreneur in residence with the Society for Brain Mapping and Therapeutics and the Brain Mapping Foundation. Previously, I was a founder and CEO of Prove Biosciences, where we were the largest player in the precision medicine space in the field of chronic pain. Actually had a really large collaboration with National Spine and Pain and Peter and the folks over there. Had a huge clinical trial there. I actually developed my passion around this stuff actually about 30 years ago when I was a teenager, following the death of a friend who was hit by a car while riding a bicycle over to my home. I led an effort to enact the very first bicycle helmet law in the United States, and then I helped the inception of what is now called Safe Kids Worldwide, which is a worldwide nonprofit organization, and enact over 300 similar laws across the United States. So you could say that the bicycle helmet was the first health-related device that I helped create a standard of care. And we invest in other things outside of this field, but this is something that's really close to our heart, and there's 4 partners in Profound.
Excellent. Thank you, Brian. And Tony, would you please introduce yourself and Aperture Ventures?
Sure. Thanks, Jennifer. So Tony Natali here, one of the 2 managing partners at Aperture Venture Partners in the New York area. We're a healthcare-focused venture firm, been around almost 20 years now, investing primarily in medical devices, everything from seed, Series A, up through growth equity. So we really do everything, all different stages and therapeutic areas within medtech. Neuromodulation has become a very strong area of interest of ours. We've got 6 neuromod companies currently in our portfolio. Axonics and Inspire, the 2 people have probably heard of, and then 4 other, much earlier stage private companies. By way of background, I'm an ENT surgeon, but have been in the venture business for 20 years now, and appreciate you all having me here today.
Excellent. Thanks for the introductions. So let's kick off this discussion to talk a little bit about the investment climate in bioelectronic medicine. So any of you can jump in here. We saw a lot of large funding rounds last year in the neurotech space, and just wanted to kind of get a view of where you think we're going and what do you think the climate is today for bioelectronic medicine. Tony, how about if you kick us off?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, it was certainly over the last, I'd say 3 or 4 years, we've seen a lot of activity on the investment front in all things neuro, but particularly neuromodulation, bioelectronic medicine. And I think that's really just driven by the successes that we've seen in the space, right? I mean, investors are fairly simple creatures to understand. And so when we see an area that has been taking off, several companies that have had tremendous amounts of success, naturally generates more interest in the field. Clearly, there's been an explosion in research and the amount of technology and new programs underway, all the way back to the very beginnings, research coming out of universities through startup and earlier stage companies. So I think it's an area at this point that's become fairly well established. When you hear medtech focused investors talking about categories in the field that they look at, neuromodulation has kind of become its own category, right? People look at orthopedics or structural heart, neuromod, right? It's become a defined field that attracts a certain amount of attention from most investors in the space. And I think it's beyond the point, when we first made an investment in this area, 10 plus years ago, it was speculative, right? It was one of those areas that nobody was really sure where it would go. Some of our investors kind of didn't understand it. And, you had to do a lot of education to justify why you would invest in the space. Whereas today, that's all in the past, right? I mean, it's a very established field. There's been a lot of commercial success, companies that have gone public, been acquired. And so at this point, it's become an established area. There's, dedicated allocations within various investment funds. And I think that makes it much easier, right? Because you don't have to get people over that hump of, why should I invest in this space, or does it make sense? And it really is more about the specific technology. And frankly, the way that any startup or early stage company is evaluated, right? Do you have a good market opportunity? Who's the competition? Are you better? What's reimbursement look like? FDA, all these things. But you don't really have to convince people to pay attention anymore. Now you just have to convince them to pay attention to you. And I think that's a much better place for everyone in the space to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe just to build off of what Tony is saying, I think, to me, like there is sort of the two classes of neuromod bioelectronic medicines, the companies that, Tony, you're mentioning, like the Inspires, the Exonics that we're going after, have gone after, established neuromod markets with reimbursement and that story. And from an investor perspective, I think that makes a lot of sense. But recently we were looking back, as I mentioned, it's almost been a decade since we've been around. We were established in 2013. And at the time, we had sort of laid out this sort of vision of what a bioelectronic medicine would be. And quite honestly, like we had sort of put that and sort of filed it away because we felt it was such a dream of the idea of a, miniaturized device implanted deep in the body on a nerve that would be able to read signals of single action potentials and potentially play that signal as well, so as to cure disease. That idea almost felt so far away that as we set out to sort of invest, yes, we invested in areas like that. But I was just looking at, and really no word of a lie, just in the last week, the companies that I have spoken to includes a company that is doing exactly that. These sort of in one, Manfred's going to speak later today about the idea of easily injectable devices deep in the body. The idea we're talking to a company right now that's reading signal off, the vagus nerve, and actually then very selectively being able to treat a particular disease, and electrodes that now have insane fidelity in terms of what we've been able to do. So although those aren't the area, from an investment perspective, investors, as Tony said, we're simple beings and we like the simple story. But what I really am excited about is that the sort of groundswell of ideas that we were thinking were science fiction 10 years ago today are their reality. So I think that those sort of ideas, as they continue to mature and show how they can compete and how they can be competitive, I think will be really exciting stuff.
Jennifer, if I can add in there, building on Imran's point, I think that some of the other segments that have been peripheral to neuromodulation are going to start influencing neuromodulation more to that point. I think as we start seeing, instead of just repurposing fundamental platforms of basic neuromodulation, pacemakers reformatted into a deep brain stimulation type approach, I think we're going to start seeing some real category improvements with what Imran was mentioning, with electrodes, with sensors, with virtual care technologies. I know Peter mentioned remote care earlier and how that's going to play a role. I think that he also mentioned about precision medicine and the ability to be able to link things to a greater degree that allows for more personalized stimulation, neuromodulation. I think we're going to start seeing some of those other areas influence this next wave of neuromodulation, neurostimulation in ways that we haven't seen before. And I think that's really exciting. We're starting to see a lot of technologies approaching it that way.
Yeah, so each of you have mentioned about the evolution of technology and how we get really excited about some of the new technology that we see coming out and how it can change therapeutic effect. But along with those lines, what are some of those indications that you see are the greatest opportunities right now?
But to me, I think that this is the other part of this, the question of when we have looked at bioelectronic medicines is, historically it was the cardiac indications, it was epilepsy, Parkinson's, it was a deep brain stimulation and spinal cord stimulation. But I think that what has always really excited us about the potential of bioelectronic medicines was its ability to go after classic drug markets. I think Peter was talking about this as well, sort of both moving up the care continuum, but in some places really addressing those sort of shortfalls that drugs just fundamentally have not been able to address. So to us, I think the basic question is still, where is the greatest unmet need? And that's irrespective of how you sort of treat that disease. And I think when you look at mental health, when you look at Alzheimer's, dementia, when you look at certain cancers as well, that those areas which I think have huge potential, inflammation is another area of obviously very broad range, and you can see the limitations that drugs pose there. We think that those are the areas where you could really go after, after these indications with non-drug solutions and unlock some real promise.
Yeah, Brian or Tony, do you have any crystal ball of some of the indications that you find most intriguing?
Well, I'll hop in. I think that there's going to be a migration pathway because there's some of these indications that have very well established regulatory pathways and reimbursement pathways like epilepsy and others. And I think what becomes a challenge for investors is, sometimes, for example, one of the more established pathways is epilepsy, yet it's not very exciting from a business standpoint. And so building the bridge from kind of where, Peter talked about some of the pitfalls with reimbursement and really kind of thinking through some of that, building the bridge from where kind of the market is to where you want it to get to go from those indications where there's reimbursement now to where you ultimately want those indications to be, whether it's going to be through kind of an off-label strategy that establishes some clinical utility that you then can go for an indication or whatever it may be. That becomes the inherent challenge. I think it's something all investors really need to be patient with and really kind of thinking through the implementation of this. My background's more as an entrepreneur and executive than as an investor over the past 30 years. And so, thinking through the implementation is critical, and it may not always, the first two steps may not be as sexy as the third or fourth step, but we really need to kind of build that bridge to be able to do that. But I definitely think the bigger conditions are obviously more exciting. I think to Imran's point where he talked about some of the gaps with pharmaceuticals, I think in the same way we've had companion diagnostics emerge, and Peter talked about being able to understand the molecular level, for example, of cancer, where we don't define cancer anymore to the extent we used to as locations in the body, geographically specific, pancreatic cancer, breast cancer, that type of thing. We're getting to the level where we're being able to understand some of the molecular levels. I think we'll get to the same point in many of the conditions that are treated with bioelectronic medicine, so that we're not just thinking of the stimulation of per se the vagus nerve, but we're talking about where that can ultimately impact and some of the associated pathways. I also think there's going to be companion devices with pharmaceuticals as well, not just companion diagnostics, where there may be a gap in the way a certain pharmaceutical is used. And so you use the pharmaceutical with a particular device to get a better outcome. I think we're going to start seeing that emerge as well.
Yeah, I'll just add that I think what we're seeing is that we're moving gradually up the complexity curve in terms of mechanism of action and moving more towards biology instead of physics, right? I mean, we sort of started off with stimulate a motor nerve, move a muscle, right? Like fairly easy to understand. And now we're talking about inflammation, metabolic disease, where it's really, how does some sort of stimulation impact biology in the way that a drug might? And that's inherently more complicated, riskier, longer development pathways, more dollars, right? But given the past successes in the space, we're seeing more appetite to bite off those kinds of problems. And we're also seeing the concept of neurostimulation or bioelectronic medicine expand a bit beyond just the very narrow definition of putting electrode on a nerve and, zapping it, and moving to things like, tumor treating fields, that are implanted in the body, which maybe blur the line a bit. I mean, is that bioelectronic medicine? Is it like implantable radiation therapy? Or you define it how you want. But I think we're going to start to see more broad uses of something electrical placed inside the body to accomplish therapy in a way that's not just directly stimulating one nerve, right? And that's kind of this new frontier we're beginning to see.
So as we're starting to see the movement from to biology, if you will, to companion devices, what's your take on the appetite of pharma or other med tech strategics to come in and do some further investment or even M&A activity?
Well, I know we're seeing pharma interested in this. I mean, a very recent use case would be Biogen's new Alzheimer's drug. Got accelerated approval and then was going to need some ongoing surveillance and additional randomized clinical trial to be able to show the clinical benefit. And I think Peter may have made this point earlier, maybe I was thinking it, but talked about the tension between pharmaceuticals and devices. Pharmaceutical companies traditionally want and I started my career in pharma, so I've seen it firsthand, want their drug prescribed, whatever the drug is, to everybody and everybody, anybody and everybody. 60% of the time it maybe works, but they want it prescribed because whether it works or it doesn't work, they get paid. And I think that what you're seeing now is with some of the more advanced therapeutics, they may need bioelectronic medicine to actually measure the outcome, not just in the trial, but in ongoing surveillance on an accelerated approval. And so, if there's fear or if there's need, whatever the motivation may be, I think we're going to start seeing some overlap there. I know, Imran's fund is obviously funded by pharma, but I think there's going to be interest there, and it may be a marriage of necessity rather than desire, but I think that's definitely going to happen with some of these conditions.
Yeah. The interesting thing, I would say, so on the two separate segments, but I think probably 10 years ago when we're looking at the decade that has passed now, we had sort of anticipated value-based medicine sort of becoming a more prominent role in sort of the blockbuster drugs in which the pharma industry is so reliant and is so dependent on, was going to become a thing of the past. And as a result of that, I would say we probably saw a greater convergence between sort of devices and pharma, which probably hasn't played out. I completely agree. And I like the way Tony is saying that, yes, it's good to see at its basics, the preclinical and now clinical research is more biology centric, but as commercial products and the reimbursement regulatory frameworks remain very different today. And so when pharma looks at devices, I'm always sort of struck by how willing they are to invest in complicated CAR T and other, immunotherapies, but yet when they look at a device, they don't quite know what to do with it. And to be honest, I think that trend will probably continue for a little while, although pharma such as GSK will dabble in the space. I don't see sort of a rush in that. But meanwhile, on the medtech strategics, there's been a great period of time where there has not been a lot of acquisitions. The IPO window, which probably, I think we'll all agree is, if not completely closed, is certainly smaller than it was last couple of years. And so you see medtechs now with a significant sort of pool of capital, a need to sort of acquire, and probably going into a market that will be more acquisitive. So I would actually think that they probably will start trending upwards in terms of their M&A activities. But pharma, while they will remain interested, to me, it remains sort of a longer game. But
yeah, I mean, I think this is very much a med tech space for the time being. People like to think that the big pharma money will show up at some point, but realistically, you need to think like a device company to be successful today. If you try to operate like a biotech, that's generally not going to fly. I think one of the interesting divides that's starting to develop is between implantables and wearables, right? I mean, the traditional, med tech approach, the products that most of the large med tech strategics have are implantables. I mean, they look like other medical devices, right? A surgeon does a procedure, they put something in your body, it's med tech, right? Through and through. As we start to see more of these wearable approaches, it's less clear how that's going to shake out, right? Because that starts to look kind of more like a drug in a lot of ways, right? It just gets prescribed. There's no procedure. You don't need a surgeon. You can try it. If it doesn't work, you stop using it. There's no commitment on the part of the patient in the way there is with a surgical approach. And as we see more and more of these wearables marching through the R&D pipeline, it's less clear to me how that area is going to shake out. How does reimbursement play out? Does that end up being med tech, and are those acquired by med tech companies? Does that migrate more onto the pharma side eventually? But just given the amount of these new wearable kind of approaches I'm starting to see anyway, I mean, I think that's something that we're going to need more clarity around going forward, because I think we're going to see more and more of those as the years go by.
Excellent. Thanks, Tony. I do want to open up questions from the audience. I think we have take a few more minutes. Jim, any questions?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to close out this panel discussion with one more question to our panelists. As we begin to emerge from this global pandemic, what are some of the trends or expected changes do you see emerging into this space? Brian, how about if you kick us off?
Sure. Well, I think I mentioned a little bit earlier about remote and virtual care. I think that one of the societal changes that's going to come out of this pandemic, at least in the short term, is the idea that when people are sick, they don't want to be around other sick people. And we've had that as a notion of health for a very long time, whether it's hospitals, whether it's the medic tent on a battlefield, whatever it may be. And so the opportunity, as Tony was mentioning, with some of the wearables, some of those devices that may not necessarily require hospitalization, but can be done or remotely monitored from the home. We're seeing a lot of the big strategics tying in apps to their devices to be able to collect data back to the clinician, where there's a service, medical device is a service kind of component. I think we're going to see those things emerge, where biomedicine can be a component of the devices that will be a part of a care at home ecosystem. It's something we're very bullish on, and taking some pretty concrete steps in that direction, because we think that's where a lot of healthcare is going to go.
Okay. Imran, what's the trend or changes that
Yeah.
you're seeing as we emerge?
So first of all, not to be the guy to say this, but emerge feels optimistic. Let's hope that's the case. But there's still 6 billion factories of COVID variants conceivably being produced. So, but yeah, let's hope that we are at a better place right now. I mean, I think obviously all the remote monitoring side, but I actually think the toughest challenge we experienced during the peak of COVID was clinical trial execution. And I think more flexibility in technologies that allow for an ability to sort of manage more of that remotely, I think is certainly something that will be compelling. I think ultimately the care delivery may still need to be implantable and may still need to be in a hospital setting for some of these therapies. But if you can minimize the number of visits a patient is making to the hospital, I think that makes sense.
And Tony, what do you see?
Okay, Jen,
Yeah.
I'm gonna go in here just to see if there's anyone in the room who has a question for one of our panelists. Okay, if not, we could take one more question and then we'll proceed to our break.
Sure, Jim, there's actually a question that's in the chat, and I'll pose it to you all. What's the investment appetite from your firms to invest in seed level, non-invasive ventures? And which indications are particularly of interest to your firm right now? Tony, do you want to take that? You can
Yeah,
talk to the
sure.
levels.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, it's saying I'm muted here. Yeah, I mean, seed med tech is tough, to be perfectly honest. It's not a space where there's the number of dedicated super early stage investors that there are in biotech. And most institutional firms in med tech tend to start at Series A as their early spot. So, if you're starting at the very, very beginning, I think you need to be extremely entrepreneurial in figuring out how to cobble together a little bit of capital to get started, whether that's angels, friends and family, universities. It's tough to rely on institutional investors for that very first check. And frankly, it's one of the biggest screening mechanisms we have, I think, is sort of seeing who's able to get out there and hustle and get some money together to get through the seed stage, when you can start to attract more institutional venture type of capital. The advice I always give entrepreneurs is you really have to look deep into your own network, right? Where does your technology come from? Universities, government, non-dilutive sources of funding, local angel networks, which tend to be probably the biggest source of funding for seed stage med tech companies, and really be willing to find the capital wherever you can to make at least a little bit of progress. Because realistically, I think you need that in order to attract most venture investors. In terms of the areas we're looking at for our earlier stage, we usually would start at Series A typically. It's big markets, right? I don't think we have any preconceived notions of where the next big thing is going to come from. If history has taught us anything, it's that some of the biggest successes come out of left field and seem impossible until you talk to the people who are actually doing it. But it's more about market size, upside potential, particularly for earlier stage companies. If there's not a really big pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, it's tough to get people interested in all the risk that comes with early stage investing. So, defining that opportunity, making sure that there is enough upside to justify starting a company, right? The classic question is, do you have a product or do you have a company, right? And the things that make a product a company tend to be the market potential, reimbursement, competitive landscape. Can you convince people that if you can do what you say you can do on the R&D side, which is a separate question, but assuming you can do that, can you see your way to a massive outcome, right? And that's really the starting point for almost all early stage investing.
Great. Yeah, thank you for answering that. Well, I think we are out of time. Imran, Brian, Tony, thank you all for joining our panel. It was a great discussion here and giving us a view of your take on the investment space in bioelectronic medicine. So I'd like to hand it back over to Jim. And I